there! If you're listening to this spot, you might have never heard of Dice Carnival, but you're gonna want to hear about this. Maybe you'll fall in love with Electroval, our musical steampunk audio adventure where a quirky cast of heroes must exhume a conspiracy after being framed for a famous murder. New upload every Tuesday. Or maybe you would fancy our whimsical Wild Beyond the Witchlight campaign that we recorded with our friends at the Homebrew D&D show. We've got plenty of episodes out now, so if you're looking for a compelling story that is guaranteed to intrigue, surprise, and make you laugh, look no further than to search Dice Carnival on your favorite podcasting feed. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye!
Welcome back, Shoe Beholder, to No One a D&D podcast. Today, I'm here with Jack Milton from Cobblepath Games. Hello.
Hello.
Some of you may recognize Cobblepath Games specifically because of Locus, which is where I actually heard about you. And that was on Kickstarter recently, wasn't it?
Yes. October? September? I don't remember. I'm terrible with dates. 2020, sort of late, early autumn sort of time-ish.
And how did that go? Did that do well?
Yeah, it did really well. We earned just over 200% of our goal.
Very nice.
And we reached 2 of our stretch goals, which is pretty great, and especially because it was our first ever Kickstarter.
Oh, that's even better. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Yes, and since then we've sort of been plugging on with it, and it should be out very soon. January 2021 is the intention at some point, but we haven't got a date yet.
Well, you're running out of time, but I'm sure you will get there.
We're very close.
That's good. But we're going to talk about Locus and talk about the director and player guide a little bit, and just talk about D&D and tabletop games overall. So I guess the first question is, what inspired this game?
So myself and you'll hear me reference Steph a lot. She's the other half of Cobblepath Games. We wrote it. We wrote Locus together. We really like horror. We're big horror buffs. We are really difficult to please, though, with the genre.
Mm-hmm.
But years ago, 7 years ago now, I think, there was a point where we went to a little local board game and anime con, and we sort of had a look around, and there were some indie board games and stuff. It wasn't the best thing, but it wasn't horrific. It was just kind of we didn't really find anything we were particularly interested in. But after going to that, we sort of sat in the hotel bar and we were just sort of talking about the fact that we should make something, because I'd been tinkering with tabletop systems for a while but never really done anything properly, especially not from scratch. It'd been a lot of hacks and stuff, and I never really put anything out there.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of decided we should make something. We wanted to make something together. We wanted to work on a project. We were like, well, what can we do? What would we be interested in? And we settled on horror, because we both like horror, but we also, at the time, felt that there weren't really any scary tabletop RPGs that we'd come across. Now, full caveat, we were not aware of the indie scene at this point, and I have absolutely no idea what it was like 7 years ago, and I have every faith that there are probably plenty of really good, really scary indie horror tabletop RPGs at the time, but we weren't aware of them.
Yeah, at the time it was there's Wizards of the Coast and there's the big ones, but... Yeah.
Our main reference point was Call of Cthulhu.
Okay.
Which was very much for a start, it was the fact that Lovecraftian horror is just, saturates tabletop RPGs. And we're not the biggest fans. We don't dislike it, but most of our favourite horror doesn't really fall under that bracket.
That's fair.
So we didn't want to do that, but also it was that's the only option, but there's so much other horror. And also there was kind of the fact that I think most of the anecdotes I've heard about Call of Cthulhu have kind of ended up being funny rather than scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's necessarily because you can't run a scary session in anything with a DM that's doing it, players who are willing to buy in, but I think it does sort of say something about some of the inherent kind of concepts and systems that Call of Cthulhu kind of generally uses, that you very often hear these like really, like genuinely really funny anecdotes about Call of Cthulhu sort of what's the word, campaigns, where you don't really hear ones about how scary it was. And I think part of that's because of the sort of like madness thing. Part of that's about just humour is quite often goes in hand with horror because it's a very strong coping mechanism for people when they're confronted with fear. But I think like also just the heavy randomness of the system, because it's a D100 system, so it's like everything's like really random basically, leads to a lot of like kind of inherently silly situations where characters who you expect to succeed at something just don't, or they miraculously do when they shouldn't. And the little bit of like my game design kind of sort of preferences here, but I don't really like super random stuff when that's not the point, because I think a lot of the time it can pull people out of caring about dice rolls. Like I think often players who know they can't rely on an outcome, at least relatively kind of like with relative certainty, basically stop caring about the outcomes and start just sort of embracing the randomness of it. But yeah, like that's not against anyone who likes the system, but we felt that there was space to do something else.
I mean, that's completely fair. I played a Call of Cthulhu game and a Delta Green game, which is Call of Cthulhuesque. It's just same concept, just you're working for the people to make the bad things go away instead of just being scared about the bad things.
Right, cool.
But it was very random. There were things where it's like, I'm great at this, so I did nope, never mind.
Yeah, it's generally a bugbear of mine anyway. I think there's systems where it works really well, and I can see the thought of it in horror, but I don't know, like it doesn't grok with me too well, and that's a kind of a personal preference thing as much as anything. But yeah, we felt there was a bit of a gap there, and so we sort of set out to make it, and we had a few kind of like core concepts that we built on the start. The main things were, one, we wanted it to be scary. That was like our primary goal. We wanted it to be scary. We like genuinely good scary horror. Two, we decided that we were going to base it around the idea that the place was evil, because it's a pretty common horror trope, but it's not one that we'd come across in RPGs at all, really. But some of our favourite stuff kind of has that from films and games and things. So we wanted to base it around like evil places. We thought that was a pretty good hook. And then the third main thing that we kind of decided that we sort of codified into what we were going to do at the start was no madness or insanity mechanic.
Yeah, that is definitely one thing I did not like about Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, I think for a start, there's a lot of very problematic issues with it, which are very well discussed by people who have a much more nuanced sort of like view of it than I'm going to be able to articulate, I think. But we are aware of those, and they are one of the reasons why we don't have it in there, alongside some gameplay reasons, like the fact that I think people don't roleplay it well at all. It doesn't work. It just becomes comedy, and when it becomes comedy, it's even worse than when it's just a bit off. But it's not great. It's not good. I don't like it. I kind of get why it's in Call of Cthulhu, but The thing is, if you look at most horror, madness in the vast majority of horror stories as well is not really something that characters go through. It tends to either be something that isn't a factor, or madness becomes something that makes them not a character in a way. Like even in Lovecraft stories, like the characters who go mad functionally stop being characters in the narrative, because they're not, by the logic of the story, they stop functioning, so they don't continue being characters. They just become either bad guys or like props, or they die, which, you know, is its own whole swathe of problems.
Yes.
Which we also weren't interested in dealing with. There's no benefit to that, and it demonizes some really standard stuff that we shouldn't be demonizing in amongst everything else. So yeah, that like no madness mechanic, no insanity mechanic was one of the core things we built into Locus as well from the start.
So with the going back to the D100 system and the randomness, you instead are using a set of or three six-sided die.
Yeah.
Is your normal roll with 3 six-sided die, or is it a 2d6 system and then like 3d6 with advantage type deal?
No, it's every roll is 3d6.
Okay.
And the dice that you use in that roll is based on the difficulty of the action. So a hard action uses the lowest dice, a medium difficulty action uses the middle dice, and a easy action uses the high dice.
Okay.
There are also opposed rolls where it's just about, and essentially a success is whether you get above your own attribute. And there are also like opposed rolls where both parties roll 3 dice, and however many dice you get over your attribute is how many points you get, and then pair points. So every roll is 3d6, which gives a pretty significant bell curve.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But one of the things we wanted to do with the system, and this is partly my own preference in roleplay systems, but also we thought it worked really well for the horror thing, which I'll probably delve into a little bit in a bit, but I'll try not to sort of go too much into it right now. But one of the things it achieves is it means that your attributes have a real weight to the dice rolls.
Mm-hmm.
In Locus, attributes are negative, so you don't spec strength, you instead spec frailty, for example. There's no dexterity, but there is a clumsiness.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of thematic horror reasons for that, but that's how it ends up being rollover. But what it means is that if you're a 1 in one of your stats, which means you have very low, which means you're very good at doing stuff with that stat, then even a hard roll has a pretty good chance of succeeding. But if you're on a 5, which is the highest you can be, an easy roll has a pretty low chance of succeeding. So your attributes really factor into your chances of actually successfully doing stuff. Or at least succeeding rolls, I should say. Because if a roll doesn't succeed, your character kind of, like, the character still does the action. It just has an unintended side effect.
Okay. So, like, if your temper is a problem and you need to roll something, like, let's say to convince someone to do something for you, and you failed, you would basically lose your temper.
Yeah.
But you might succeed, but you would just possibly make them a little angry at you for getting or upset or scared.
Yes, and with social roles, you might not necessarily convince them entirely, but they would probably at least hear you, depending on the situation, because the way NPCs work is a little bit odd in Locus, just because of the thematic grounding of the horror thing. I will get into that a little bit when we do the sort of spoiler territory, though, because it's all behind the veil for players a little bit. But yeah, so like, and I think the classic example we use in the book is if you're trying to like kick open a door, you'd roll against your frailty, and if you fail, you probably kick open the door most of the time, but you might get injured doing it, or you might make a ton of noise and alert something that you don't want to alert.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of the intention of how it works. It makes stuff interesting, but it doesn't. The last thing we wanted to do was discourage people from taking actions, because it's quite an easy thing to end up in the corner with, especially in horror, where you can end up with characters that are just like, no, I'm not going to do it. There's a monster outside. I'm not going to move. I'm just going to stay here.
Yeah, I can see a couple of these coming into play with some of my characters I have in like other systems. Like impatience is a big one for some of my characters, and then maybe cowardice would also come and play with different characters.
Yeah,
but it's funny to see it as a different perspective versus like just a personality trait, and that's just how you kind of flavor it.
Yeah, we went through quite a few iterations of attributes actually throughout developing it. Cowardice and temper. No, I think impatience and temper were quite late, and they were because we kind of looked at what happens to characters in horror stories and why do they fail. What gets the better of them? We're like, oh yeah, a lot of characters have really high tempers and they get angry, and that's kind of causes problems. It shouldn't be, but I think it creates quite an interesting thought process when you're developing your characters for Locus, and it sort of skews the point of view a little bit.
That sounds like a lot of fun. That's actually, the dice mechanic is a mechanic I haven't seen before, so that's very interesting to me because I've played in a bunch of different tabletop games, and there's like a couple that are like very common, like D100 system, like Call of Cthulhu,
Yeah.
the D20 system, the 2D6s, and it's like 6 or lower is a fail, 7 to 9, and then 10 plus. And the Fate system or the Savage World system, where it goes up by dice numbers.
Yeah.
So this is the first time I've seen the 3D6 system personally, and I'm interested to see it in gameplay, to see how it works. It sounds intriguing, and I can see how it would make it harder to succeed with the 3 dice and having to take the lowest number.
Yeah, I think it's not one I would want for a combat heavy power play kind of game.
Yeah,
because it is quite punishing it punishes you for your high stats a lot. That's generally appropriate for horror though. But yeah, like I'm really pretty proud of it. And I haven't seen any other systems with it either. That doesn't mean there aren't any, but I have not come across them. It was one I sort of developed years and years ago. That's pretty much been in there since the start.
So if you stole it, it was purely through accident.
Yes. Yeah, if someone else has come up with it, then we did it completely independently. Or they stole it from me. But
you're both geniuses.
Yeah, we're both geniuses. Okay. No, I think I think it works really well for Locus, and I could see it working really well for some games in particular, very kind of like narrative style games that aren't really based about overcoming obstacles too much. I wouldn't really want it in something like Mutants and Masterminds or D&D, where it's kind of like about kind of like overcoming obstacles.
Yeah, it would definitely be a specific type of game mechanic, like not one that's for everything. And it's just like the 2D or the D6 system for like Honey Heist and games like that.
Yeah.
And Mall Kids, where you're just trying to, you have 2 stats and you're just trying to you only have 1d6, you try to beat that one stat. That won't necessarily work in everything either. Like if there's anything where you can do more than 2 things, that's out the door.
Yes. Yeah, like I'm a big proponent for my sort of design methodology. I would describe as design specific. So I identify what I want to achieve and then I make something for that. And I'm a big believer of making stuff that works for what your goals are and identifying what a game's goals are and using it for that. So yeah, I mean, we've made 3 games so far. We're sort of mildly working on a 4th in the background that might or might not see some light this year, depending on how other things go.
I saw you just announced one.
Is that Heroes of Hyrule?
Yes.
Yeah, that one's a personal project. That's got nothing to do with Cobblepath. Just as a sort of disclaimer, Nintendo, please don't sue me. It's for free. The company didn't make it. I made it as a fan side project. But yeah, so actually 5 games. None of them have even remotely the same dice system.
I'll include the link just in case anybody's interested in checking out that personal project.
Yeah, if people want to check it out, it's a work in progress. I'm working on it slowly in my own time on the side. It's playable. It's completely playable, but it is not done.
It was really funny because one of my friends shared it and I got the notification as we just started recording. So I was like, oh, hey, I know that person.
Yes, that's what I like.
Going down the list, the next thing in here is like Haunts and Virtues.
Yes. So Virtues are a relatively small part, so I'll start with them, yes. But Haunts and Virtues are kind of like they are the real core of the game, I guess, for the characters. So Virtues are essentially just a thing your character has good about them. Like the character sheet is not entirely negative. So Virtues are about what your character sort of holds dear. It's not particularly unusual. There's a lot of systems that have a virtue kind of thing. And essentially it's a way for you to gain willpower, but it's also a way for you to discard cards from your hand, which I will get to. Your haunt, however, is a much bigger thing. So the haunt, all characters have to have a haunt in Locus. And a haunt is an event from their life at some point that weighs on someone. So this isn't something that everybody in real life has, but the idea is that in order to be a character that would be in a Locus and would have the experiences that Locus is built to create, you must have a haunt because Locus is to latch on to people who have them. And haunts can be a whole load of different things, and stuff like guilt is not required, but it's something that sort of like weighs on you in some way. So some examples that we've got: people who dropped out of college. For some people that might not be a haunt, but for others it might be something that they regret, or that they feel they did wrong, or that they could have done different.
Right.
I had one character in a game that we played of it at one point whose haunt was that they moved out to go to uni, leaving their single mother alone. And, like moving out to advance your education and achieve a degree and things are not really a bad thing. And I don't think anybody would begrudge him for doing that. But the fact that he had guilt for that, guilt is not mandatory, but it is a thing that you can have. It meant that was a decision that weighed on you. You can always go with the cliche and have things like, oh, you killed someone, or you accidentally killed someone, or you caused an accident that injured someone. I don't think we've ever, in any of like the official Locus stuff, we haven't had characters who have been like outright murderers. We try to kind of like stay away from that in our main ones, because we want to encourage people to come up with stuff that's a little bit more normal, I guess. But we do have some people who've like caused harm to others and things like that. So, and the idea is that you create a haunt, and that haunt influences a lot of what your character experiences throughout the game.
That's cool. All right, so staying on the track of the haunts and virtues, because that requires a deck of cards.
Yes.
So playing cards, it says, represent the connection between the cast and the world around them. And that's how the cards, and I'm assuming that you said that they have cards in their hand.
Yep.
So give like an example of how that could work. You don't have to go into the full details of everything, because we want people to go buy the book, right?
Well, yeah.
So, but you can go into like a little, just like an example of what you would do.
Sure. So there's a bunch of different reasons why you might draw a card, but characters usually start with 2 to 3 cards in their hand at the start of the game. I think 3 is the standard that we put in the book, but for shorter campaigns you might want to have less, or more. Actually, for shorter campaigns, for longer campaigns, you might want to have less. The idea is that that's kind of how much of a sort of connection and like how much of binding the world has to them. So a bunch of things can make you draw cards, such as, essentially, the primary one is when a character sees something that's related to their haunt, or when they take an action that's related to their haunt. So, for example, if their haunt was stealing, like they used to steal stuff, and there was one particular time that usually haunts have to be like a singular event, so there'd usually be one time where they stole something particularly valuable, or something that had some particular ramifications for them stealing it. But they might, during play, decide to use those stealing skills to help, or just they want to steal something because they're not somebody who feels guilty about it or feels bad about it or whoever's changed. And they might do that, and that might mean that they draw a card. And depending on the suit that they draw, depends on what happens, but for the most part, they just go into your hand. And as far as players are concerned, basically just more cards in the hand is bad, and you can get rid of them by doing certain things primarily related to your virtues. And otherwise, players don't really know what other effects the cards have. They're just aware that more is bad, and the characters can feel that.
That's pretty cool. I like that the suits are all connected to different vices and virtues.
Yeah.
Which adds a little bit of fun to it and then a unique perspective.
There's some really nice stuff in the book linked to that we're really pleased with. Especially now the graphic designer's got their hands out.
I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, me too. For work, at least. And I'll go into a little bit about that when we do the spoiler chat a little bit later, because there's some really cool stuff linked to the vices that the director knows about, but the players don't.
Okay. So the next group of sections is willpower and stress, and then calming down. So it looks like, from just a quick overview, stress is gained by doing things poorly or getting hurt in the process. And then calming down is like, you need to take a breather, you need to stop, you need to heal yourself or things like that.
Or succeed at stuff. Not at roles, but like advancing your kind of goals. So if it's difficult to kind of like explain, I guess, but it's basically if the characters kind of like advance, like if they have a revelation on how to step forwards in the game, like they figure out a way that they might be able to escape or something, then a lot of that will reduce stress.
Okay.
So it's not just, we wanted the reduction of stress to be vaguely proactive as much as possible. But yeah, extended rests are like a way to do it if you can get the chance to.
And then willpower is, what is willpower used for?
It's an expendable resource for re-rolling dice.
Okay, so kind of like, I don't know if you've played Savage Worlds.
No, I haven't actually.
Savage Worlds use a thing called bennies, so it's basically a luck die or a inspiration for D&D where you get to re-roll.
World of Darkness uses willpower a lot for various things like this.
Okay.
Essentially, the willpower and stress are quite interlinked because the level of your stress reduces how many dice a willpower lets you re-roll.
Okay.
So if you're stressed, which is the highest level of stress, you can only re-roll 1 dice per willpower. Whereas if you're uneasy, which is the lowest level, you can roll up to 3. You can re-roll all the dice if you want to.
Interesting.
And you can actually spend as much willpower as you want on a roll. And you don't have to spend it all at once. You can keep re-rolling 1 dice if you really, really want to. But willpower is quite rare. And later on, like if you're stressed, it becomes really expensive.
That's fair. And that makes a lot of sense too. Now I'm skipping down a little bit because I'm going to characters now. We kind of discussed a little bit about characters and like we mentioned a lot of it up on the top section.
Yeah.
But the character concept is fairly common for most games. Like what do you want to play? What generic idea do you want? I like though the attitude section that you have.
Ah, yes.
I one of the things that popped out to me was the pessimistic attitudes, especially considering I mentioned that earlier today when we were just talking. But that it's kind of interesting to have like you have 4 pessimistic and like 4 optimistic options. And I'm sure each of them have their own pros and cons.
They are, for the most part, they are just about how your character views their haunt. So you kind of go through the spectrum of whether you didn't think anything was done wrong up to you believe you were utterly culpable. And optimists believe that they can kind of like be better than that and that stuff's going to work out. And pessimists tend to kind of like resign themselves to anywhere between like being an awful person or everyone's awful, so it wasn't a problem.
That's fair.
And they have some effects, but most of them are on the director's side. They're kind of a lot of cues for directors in particular, but they are very much a kind of like role-play guidance for how characters are supposed to kind of like see their own failings.
Okay. So the rest of this seems pretty normal for tabletop games. So I'm sure like everything offers like a lot, but I don't want to like spoil it for everybody. I want people to go get the book and look at it and read it. Like a lot of the things seem really promising just from skimming through the book so far.
Well, thank you.
I do want to play the game.
Awesome.
Obviously. What's one thing that you're particularly proud of with the system that you guys created?
Oh, that's a tricky one. In general, we're really proud of the whole thing, but I think one thing that I feel it is notable to highlight, that I would like to highlight, is the item system.
Mm-hmm.
So items are really simple in Locus, but they're a really big deal. So the way most items work is that you get them on a card, and if you can use them to help you achieve a role, like something that you would make a roll for, then they lower the difficulty by 1 stage.
Okay.
Occasionally, items will make something possible where it wasn't otherwise possible. For example, I think this became like a thing that we actually had to edit this out of the book because we had it for like every example for item use in the entire book at one point. And went, oh, that's not good. Lockpicks, for example. You might not be able to actually open a door without lockpicks or something approximating a lockpick.
Mm-hmm.
Or you may not be able to open a locked gate without like bolt cutters, for example. But there's a couple of things that I think are kind of like quite interesting about them. One of them is that they degrade. So every time you use an item to make it roll easier, you tick off a point of durability. And different items will have different amounts of durability. And when their durability is empty, when all the boxes are full, whenever you use it, you make a roll based on its quality. So some items are really well made, some are just held together with like duct tape and hope. If you fail the roll based on its quality is how you decide what you need to roll. If that roll fails, the item just breaks and it's just gone. It's done. Except for in certain circumstances, which are written about in the book, which is where that item has a core function that allows characters to operate at standard level. And what I mean by that generally is primarily that's for accessibility items. So something like a walking stick, for example, that allows a character to walk at the same speed as all the other characters. That walking stick will not break if it gets to 0 durability and it fails its roll, but it will no longer be allowed to be used to make rolls easier.
Okay.
So it loses all its mechanical ability, but the character still operates at the same level as every other character. Which was inspired quite heavily by the combat wheelchair, and a lot of the explanations that Sarah, who wrote it, has given about what the intention of that device is, of that sort of game system that she wrote is, and things like that. But I was quite pleased because we decided to put that in and realised it really wasn't a problem to do it. Like we didn't have to change anything to accommodate that. And it was something that kind of was brought to our attention this year, not by anybody saying you need to put this in the game, but by us seeing stuff like the combat wheelchair. And we only joined Twitter this year, so being part of the wider TTRPG community is new to me and has been exciting and really interesting and enlightening. But a lot of that sort of discussion is stuff that we hadn't really been exposed to previously. And we're glad we've been exposed to it before we got the chance to play the game, because we think the game's made a lot more accessible and a lot more sort of like open to people, which we're really pleased with. And we're really happy that we were able to do it before we put it out fully into the world. I mean, it was actually released last November on a pay what you want model, but this is like the full release with graphic art and editor, which we sorely needed, and variety of.
That he does, who publishes anything with words.
Yeah. Oh boy, our editor is just best. Like, she's amazing. She's been so great, and she has made such a difference. So yeah, like I think for a start, I like the item system because I like having the way the items work on cards. I like that players end up with something physical that they can hold, that's kind of like tangible, that they can then have to give up because they overused it. Because one of the core kind of like fears that we play with in Locus a lot, that the system kind of like facilitates really well, is the fear of one's own failings. And the items play into that because we want people to be using items to make things easier, but we also want people to be questioning whether they should have.
It's like, should I have done that? Maybe it was unnecessary. Maybe it was necessary, but now I might need it later.
Yeah, and that's also why they don't immediately break. Why reducing durability to 0 doesn't break them outright. It gives you a chance to break them, which makes it even worse to actually then use it, because you can't be certain that you're going to lose it.
That's fun. So like, there's a chance that you're fine. It's like, yeah, we're good. You got that. But then there's a chance that's like, ah, oh, crap, it broke.
Yeah, and then you can, depending on whether depending on what you've made the item cards out of, you tear it in half, throw it away. It's gone. I like doing that, but I'm also aware that a lot of people bought our reusable cards.
Yeah, so
which don't do that with those.
Maybe just place them in the box.
Yeah,
gently.
Well, what you could do is wipe off the marker, because they're dry wipe erasable cards.
There you go.
So yeah, you wipe the item away in that case, rather than tearing the card in half. But yeah, we in all our prototypes, they're obviously like printed card and paper. So it was always fun to rip things in half when they broke.
That sounds like a lot of fun, actually. I never thought about that. Like, there's always been like tracking systems for like, oh, you have X amount of arrows, and video games have durability.
Yeah,
but it always seemed like it was a daunting task, because it was for things like your sword that you just keep swinging with constantly, and your armor that you keep using constantly.
Yeah.
But if it's an item that's used for a specific purpose, that's a fun little concept that adds a little bit of randomness to this game for people who like that type of thing.
Yeah, and it's funny because I actually hate durability systems in video games. I've played some that have them that I really like, where I think it does a lot of really cool work, but most of the time I'm like, ugh.
Well, that's because you have to keep going and fixing all your armor.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I have to go fix my armor again? God, why?
Yeah, it gets really frustrating, but like horror games do it quite well generally. Just resource management works in horror very well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So for the next little bit, why don't you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but just go into a couple of things that you would like future DMs to know about the system. So for anybody who's listening, the next section is going to be slightly spoilery. If you're going to be playing this as a player, I will ask Greg, if you are, since you'll be listening to this, can you please put in the description the time that people should skip in the description down below, please. Spoiler zone starting now.
Brilliant, cool. So our version of a DM is called a director, which is pretty much just because it sounds kind of sinister, but also because of the filmic overtones.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that I will say is this is a very director-heavy system. No two ways about it. It demands a lot of pre-game prep from a director. I think it's probably the greatest flaw of the system, but I also think it's kind of necessary to achieve what we wanted to achieve. The flip side to that is that I think in the grand scheme of things, it's not hugely director-heavy to actually run. There's a lot of stuff to keep track of, but a lot of it kind of falls in the player's lap rather than the director's. So you can kind of leave it to them to track, rather than having to track it yourself. But there are a few things that you kind of have to plan it out in advance. One, the big ones that are kind of like the big hooks for the game are that monsters are made for each character.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah. So it's like the big cool thing for the game, and it's something that's really interesting. We've got like a whole chapter about how to make a monster. But the thing is that you kind of have to put them. And the minimum for any given story that you're going to run is that every single character that you've got a player playing should have a monster, and the Locus itself should have a monster. And that's the minimum. So 4 players, that's 5 monsters you've got to make. And we have got some sample monsters in the book, but you don't want to use them for players unless a player decides to come up with the same backstory that those monsters have. The whole point is that the monster is a manifestation of the character's haunt, so it should represent it. And this is where some of the things like the vices come in, which are the 4 suits that the haunts fall under. So haunts are, and they represent the sort of driving force behind why the haunt happened. And the 4 are temptation, apathy, discord, or malice. And characters will pick those, and it affects which cards they get to keep in their hands, because if they draw a card that's the same suit as their virtue, they immediately discard it, so it doesn't add to their hand. But if they draw a card that's the same suit as their haunt, it's kind of like a sticky card, so it's much harder for them to get rid of that card. So there's some factors in there, but there's also, we've got these chunks in the book of imagery related to each of those vices as sort of like general stuff, and sort of the kind of things that you would make a monster for those different vices be like, but they are just general guidance. So some examples that I can draw off the top of my head are like sort of, we've got colour palettes for each of them, and malice is reds and purples. I think it might be reds and yellows. I think temptation is reds and purple, like the purple side of red. Malice is the yellowy orangey side of red, and malice has things like claws are a big one, just blood in general. Or you've got things like discord has elements like static. Discord monsters often give people like headaches. Discord is about breaking up community. It's about not liking groups or not liking people getting together. So there's some really interesting, like, we're pretty pleased with that chapter and how that all pans out, and it's one of the more interesting parts of the game. But the idea is you'd also work in imagery from the character's haunts. So, for example, we've got a character in the pre-gen campaign that's in the back of the director's guide, who's in that campaign. I think it's in that campaign. Yeah, they got hit by a car, and like in a complete accident. It was kind of their fault because they ran out into the road. They got hit by a car, and then they sued the person who was driving the car and got them put in jail for a couple of years, which meant that they missed years of their kid growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it because they were angry at them, and it was a malice horn. So their monster has some elements of like car engines, and it makes cars.
Oh, okay.
But it's also got some like quite malicey imagery to it. But the hope is that you'll make monsters that will both be symbolic and really interesting and kind of terrifying on their own, hopefully, but also that when they turn up, the character who they relate to kind of has a stomach drop and goes, oh, that's mine.
It's like, oh no.
Yeah.
Why did I pick that thing? Dang it. I meant puppies. I'm afraid of puppies.
Oh, then you'll just get a monster made of nothing but dead puppies, probably.
Oh, no, I changed my mind. I meant...
It wouldn't be good.
Pillows? I don't know.
They're never good. Yeah, we got some quite interesting ones in the director's guide, 3 of which were made by top-tier backers from the Kickstarter,
Mm-hmm.
who have, by the way, made some absolutely awesome monsters, and I'm so happy with them. All 3 of them made really cool things. So, and then we've got a load in the there's 8 monsters in the pre-written story at the back of the book.
Mm-hmm.
So they are relatively easy to make from a mechanical point of view, though. The mechanics of monsters are very, very simple, deliberately, because we want people to be able to make their own. So they're not like these huge stat blocks. They're pretty simple. It's quite easy to understand what they do and how they work, and operating and using really, really simple, but you kind of have to delve into the elements of the game and the implications of haunts and really sort of dive into what their character has done and the sort of symbology of it to properly make this for Locus.
That all sounds like a lot of fun.
Hope so.
So we're going to exit spoiler zone now.
Cool.
Welcome back from the spoiler-free zone, or from the spoiler zone to the spoiler-free zone. This is where Greg put the thingy that it ends. So overall, Locus sounds like a fantastic story, and it sounds like a great system to play, and I'm very excited. I want to play it very much so.
Thank you.
So we should do that one day on Beholder to One Shot, if you're up for it. Unless there's anything else you want to add about Locus.
Not in general, I don't think so, no.
Okay. So let's just talk about tabletop games overall.
Cool.
Just because my favorite topic. That's why I have a freaking podcast. What is your favorite tabletop RPG game other than your own systems?
Mutants and Masterminds.
I haven't played that one. I do want to.
Honestly, it is a commitment.
Not a one-shotter?
It's a one-shotter. It's just making characters. It's like you can make characters using like a pre-gen thing that they've done,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually really robust and really great. But the reason why I like it is making characters, but making characters is not easy. So I'm not sure it's going to remain my favourite because I backed a lot of Kickstarters this year. As I entered the community, I've met a lot more indie devs who I've got the chance to get my hands on some of their games.
Mm-hmm.
And I also got Through the Breach for Christmas from my housemates, but I haven't played that yet. But Through the Breach is looking awesome, so I don't know.
I haven't heard of that one either. Why are there so many games that I don't know exist?
Through the Breach is really niche because it's the role-playing system for a fairly small skirmish game called Malifaux.
Mm.
So yeah, it's set in that world and it does a load of really cool stuff. But I might get to that. But Mutants and Masterminds is currently my favourite, and it's my favourite because for a very long time, my primary goal that I wanted to make, like my white whale of design, was I wanted to make a system where you could play anything, like a character with any powers, any sort of body shape, anything at all, but it was mechanically represented. Because there were a lot of systems that said you can play absolutely anything, like Fate, for example, but they kind of achieved that by essentially not having rules
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of the stuff that you might want rules for, or by like essentially boiling rules down to real basics. And there's nothing wrong with that approach, and there's a lot of people that really like it, but it's really not my jam. I like to feel that my character is mechanically distinct to the person sitting next to me. It's just a thing I no longer have the dream of making that system, because I don't think I'll do it better than Mutants and Masters does.
That's fair.
It's got an incredibly powerful character system. It's a superhero system for those that don't know it. It's got an incredibly powerful character gen system that you all sorts of different stuff, like basically any superhero that exists in a comic book or an established property, you could make them. And basically also any anime character or any character from anything. You can pretty much make anything.
Mm-hmm.
And they will feel mechanically distinct to other characters. The catch comes that making a character takes hours and is very mathsy and is not something you can just kind of like dive into. Also, it's a D20 system, and I don't like single D20 systems typically, but it pulls it off. It's a weird one because it's incredibly simple to play. It's really simple to play, but making a character is ridiculously complicated.
Yeah, there's a couple of games that I've played that have like this very confusing character creation concept. So that kind of it's a shame because it probably turns away a lot of people.
Yeah.
And they're just like, fuck that. If that's that confusing to make a character, it's gonna be super confusing to play the game. And then in actuality it's not that confusing. I think the way that I personally enjoy doing that is either building characters with people who actually understand how to play, or building pre-gen characters so that they don't have to think about that character creation aspect of it, and can just jump into the game system. And then once they fall in love with it, they'll be like, oh, well, what else can I do with this system?
The way we've ended up doing it with our group, that's kind of quite big because it's a very dip in, dip out kind of game that my housemate runs of it. Is essentially people will tell people who don't want to delve into the character creator, which is most of the other people playing, tell us what they want, and then me and or him make the character for them.
Yeah.
Because we really like making characters, so we don't mind. But yeah, like I think it's very much a system that you'd want to either use the random roll / pick from a short list character creator that's in the book, which is it's pretty good actually, to be honest. Like it's a pretty robust, easy to use character creator, or use pre-gen. Yeah, I agree. It's very much a system that you either want to use pre-gens or use character gen for the first time you're playing with it, unless you're really into crafting complex characters. But I really like it. I think it's, from a design point of view, it's quite an interesting one in the way it does powers. So people who are interested in making their own games, it's a really cool one to look at because it kind of does stuff quite different from a lot of other games.
That's cool. I'll have to look into that one though, with if it is a complex system that kind of is like, maybe. Like it sounds like a lot of fun otherwise. For anybody out there who wants to make their own game and their own system, what is something that you would like to give it, or what advice would you give to them?
Primary advice, beyond the sort of standard of just start making it, just do it and play it, is the main one. But the other one that I'd say that I don't hear very often is set your goals. What do you want the system to do? What's your plan? Give yourself like 3 bullet points. And the reason for that is a couple of reasons. Is one, that it's just good practice to kind of like figure out what you're doing, and it allows you to build something to what you're doing rather than just kind of like fluffily making stuff think it sounds cool. Which honestly, when you're starting out, do that. If that's the way you want to roll, like make some stuff and see how it pans out. That's totally legit. But if you're serious about making a finished, polished product, my advice would be, at least the method that I have found success with, is lay yourself out a few bullet points of what you want the core of the system to be. What are the 3 things that you know now should be elements of the system you check against? And what that allows you to do is to, when you're looking back at the system, like post-play test, you're like evaluating how you're doing, you can measure everything you've got against those points. Go, is this part of the system doing these? And if it's a no, and you don't have a good reason to keep that in, then you take that part out, and you can put it on a shelf for another system if you want. But if it's not achieving the system's goals, then it can come out. And it's really good for helping you make the hard decisions about when to cut stuff, because it's really easy to just overbloat things. And that's mostly born from the fact that Locus went through a lot of revisions, but it went through 2 major overhauls, sort of 5 years or so that we were actually making the system.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, definitely, which became kind of like the final version of the system, was very much informed by our 3 bullet points of what we wanted it to achieve. So yeah, that's my main thing, is kind of like set out your goals. What experience do you want the system to make?
Those are some good suggestions. All right, well, I think, honestly, that covers everything. So where can everybody find you?
So I'm at TCrusading on Twitter, but there's also at Cobblepath, which is more official and less personal me. We also have a website on cobblepathgames.co.uk. We are going to be on Itch, and we are also already on Drive-Thru, but the next couple of weeks we'll be on there. But if you want to know more about us, if you want to stay up to date with what we're making, we have a mailing list on our website, and that's the place to go, which is cobblepathgames.co.uk.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And then we will be in discussion about a future one-shot of this, perhaps.
Yes.
So everybody, please check out the descriptions down below for all the details that were shared today. If you haven't already or didn't back the Kickstarter for Locus, you can find all the details if we have them down in the information bar below. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And you can find us wherever podcasts can be found, and follow me on Twitter at beholder2no1 or on our website at beholder2no1.com. And if you like tabletop games, this is the perfect place to be. So keep being awesome. Bye.
Bye.